Welcome to this retro review of the PMDG 737NG for Flight Sim 2004. We're covering this today for a few reasons. The first is that this was PMDG's first 737 model, and with the latest one just around the corner, I thought it would be quite fun to see how the original will compare to the new one when it's released. The second reason is that I wanted to re-familiarise myself with the 737 ahead of the new model's release. I figure this video should also serve as a tutorial for any of my viewers who do fly a PMDG 737, whether it's this version, the NGX, or the NGXU, because the basics are largely the same. The final reason is that this channel is all about making flight sim accessible to everybody. Now, this plane cost me £5 from a second-hand store, so I hope this video demonstrates that you don't need to spend $80 or $90 to have a basically study-level experience in a flight simulator. Let's run through the basics of a cold and dark start. So, batteries and standby power on, ground power goes on. Turn on the window heat, and now we'll check that the trim air is on and that the packs are off. Finally, we switch on the cabin utilities and in-flight entertainment. This puts the plane into a state where we're ready to start setting up the FMC. If you like, you can clear out the master warnings on the panel. Shift and 6 brings up the FMC. If we flick over to FMC mode and go to route, we enter our origin and destination airports. We're flying here from Stansted to Inverness. In the departures arrival screens, we'll pick a departing runway and a SID at Stansted. So we're on runway 05, or what the sim calls 05, I think it's actually 04 in real life. Pick a SID and activate and execute. If we go back to departures arrivals and choose arrivals, we can pick an arrival runway at Inverness, but there are no stars or transitions, so we just click execute. Clicking into the route page, we can start to configure our waypoints. I'll demonstrate the entry of one waypoint here, the rest work the same way, and then we'll skip to the end. With all the waypoints in place, hit execute to commit the plan, then head over to the legs page and make sure there's no gaps in your flight plan. Going back to the route page, from there you can go to the perf page. Clicking on the soft key next to gross weight will auto enter that and your zero fuel weight. If you are using SimBrief or similar, you can enter your actual reserve fuel. For demo purposes, we're just going to enter 1 here. And again, for demo purposes, cost index to 100, but you can set it to whatever your flight plan says. Cruising altitude for this flight will be 26,000 feet. If you have data for cruise winds and top of climb temperature, you can enter them here, but it's not necessary for VNAV to work. Finally, we'll enter the transition altitude of 5,000 feet. Press execute, click through to the M1 limit page. You can set a restricted takeoff here if you want. Go through to the takeoff page, enter your takeoff flaps, going flaps 5 here, and click on the V-speed soft keys to auto-populate the V-speeds. Heading back up to the overhead panel, we will turn on one fuel pump. We will start the APU. Once the APU is available, turn on the APU generators. With that done, we'll switch on the remaining fuel pumps. I always forget the center tanks, but you'll probably want to switch them on. And the final hydraulic pumps. We can then switch on the APU bleed air. And it's now time to start the engines. I set the engine start switch to both for convenience, and to start the left engine, flick the left engine over to ground. In some configurations of the plane, you also have to switch on the fuel to the engines, but in this 737 they're on by default. With a good start on engine number 1, flick engine number 2 over to ground. When engine number 2 comes to life, you've successfully started the PMDG 737. We'll now switch on the engine generators. Switch off the APU bleed. And set the packs to auto. Switch off the APU. Switch the yaw damper on. And we can now switch on some lights. We can now clear the master caution and switch on the flight director. When you switch on FD1, FD2 automatically comes on in this version of the plane. Shift A opens the radio panel, set nav1 and nav2 to your destination's ILS. Also set the course to match the course of your destination ILS. To find these frequencies, I use the website apxp.info, but you can also get the same from a Navigraph subscription. I now check that the takeoff trim in the FMC matches the takeoff trim that's set on the pedestal in the aircraft. We'll also make sure the maximum bank angle is set to 30 degrees. Clearing up the last few bits here, we'll make sure our squawk is set and the transponder set to TARA. We'll set minimums. I like to set radio mins of 150, and now just configure the ND to your liking. Final jobs on the overhead panel: enter your cruising altitude into the cabin altitude panel, and that will auto adjust the cabin altitude based on your cruising out. Then switch on the probe heat and anti-ice as required. Also arm the emergency exit lights. Our final jobs on the main panel are to configure the MCP, so set your initial speed to your V2 speed, set the auto brake to RTO, set the altitude to your cruising altitude, and VNAV will automatically step climb up to that, taking restrictions into account. Also activate LNAV, will activate VNAV in flight. Now set your flaps to takeoff config, so flaps 5 for our flight, and also arm the auto throttle. With that done, we're good to go. I think the only thing this plane doesn't model is aligning the IRS at the start. Aside from that, a very in-depth cold and dark start procedure. So we bring our throttles up to full. You'll see I am carrying a full load of fuel here, which is the default, but you can configure that either in the PMDG load manager, or you can change it in the sim once you're on the tarmac. Obviously, I'd recommend you set the fuel to match the flight you're doing based on your flight plan. After the V1 and rotate calls, we bring the nose back and the plane starts to lift off the runway and climb. Crossing 400 feet, we can activate the autopilot and switch on VNAV. When you're happy that the plane is climbing as it should, bring up the landing gear. The plane behaves completely correctly. It doesn't do any weird stuff. It follows its LNAV and VNAV as it should. When you see the flap indicators on the PFD next to your speed, bring the flaps up. With that done, I'll usually arm the spoilers and set the auto brake to max. As we pass through 5,000 feet, barometer to standard. What's really impressive in this 18-year-old add-on is that VNAV obeys altitude constraints as it climbs. There's a lot of aircraft, even in modern flight simulator, that don't do that yet. And of course, once it passes the constraint, it continues to climb based on the path programmed in the FMC. And once the plane passes through 10,000 feet, it will accelerate from 250 knots to whatever the cruise speed in the FMC is set to. There are, of course, proper top of climb and top of descent icons displayed on the ND. One of the ways I judge flight sim add-ons, especially payware add-ons, is the accuracy of the predictions in the FMC. In this plane, it predicts we're going to hit top of climb at 12:33, 12:34, and that is exactly when we do hit our top of climb. I think there were a couple of adjustments on the way up from 31 or 32, but by and large, that's pretty good. Once you hit top of climb, the plane levels off and provides an equally accurate top of descent estimate. At top of climb, I flick through the FMC legs page and look for our bottom of descent altitude. This flight isn't a great example because when approaching an airport with a star, you will generally be given a final altitude or an intercept altitude just before the runway, which you can then set your MCP altitude to. In this case, I'm setting the MCP out to a fairly sensible 2,000 feet. Setting the MCP out at top of climb will allow VNAV to automatically start the descent when it hits its top of descent marker. At this point, I'll also set our approach speed and flap config in the approach ref page. At top of descent, the plane will pitch down, back off the throttle, and begin its descent, and it will stick to any altitude constraints that are in the FMC on the way down. At 10,000 feet, of course, the plane will level off until it's slowed down to 250 knots, then it will continue its descent. The 737 seems quite slippery, so you may have to apply spoilers as you decelerate and as you descend. If spoilers are required, the FMC will let you know with a drag required message and an audio cue. Spoilers are found on the pedestal and can be dragged into flight detent for maximum deceleration. Also, remember to set your altimeter to local pressure when you pass 5,000 feet on your descent. As it turns out, Inverness didn't have ILS in 2004, so the final phase of this flight, the ILS approach, will use footage from an approach to Stansted, just so I can show the functionality. Intercepting the localizer disables VNAV. Once established, hit approach. In the 737, I put the gear down super early just for the extra drag it gives you. Get the final approach speed dialed in and add flaps until correctly configured. I have Autopilot 2 activated for an Autoland, although at the moment it's a single channel, it eventually switches over. Some things I wasn't expecting in this simulation of the 737 is that the localizer and approach lights extinguish when you're on the glide slope, even though Autopilot is active and flying it. I'm not sure if that's more or less accurate than the other stuff I've flown. Also, there don't seem to be any flashing diamonds or Land 3 annunciator when both autopilots are switched on, even though, as you'll see in a minute, the plane does auto-land. I feel like maybe that one is just a limitation of the sim at the time. You'll see that flare mode is active on the PFD, but there is no indication of a rollout mode. But you've got to remember, this is Flight Sim 2004, the planes don't really move around on the runway once they've landed anyway. So as we get close to the runway at the end of our approach, the plane backs off the throttle, it then flares, floats for a bit and makes a smooth touchdown on the runway. It also pitches the nose down after landing, and we can then apply the reversers. Auto brake does appear to work, but I take over the braking once we hit the tarmac just out of habit and bring the plane to a stop. As we finish our flight, I'll also cover the shutdown procedure. If you made it this far, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please feel free to drop a like and maybe subscribe, as I make this kind of content fairly regularly. To shut down the 737, apply the parking brake and head up to the overhead panel. Start the APU. Once it's available, switch on the APU generators. Switch on APU bleed and switch off the engine bleed. You can now cut fuel to the engines. All the systems are now running off the APU and the plane is in a good turnaround mode. Obviously you'd do this at the gate, not in the middle of the runway, but this is just a demo. Let's watch the replay of our landing at Stansted and give some final thoughts on the PMDG 737. In terms of simulation depth, not only does this product still stand up today, it actually has more functionality and, most importantly, more reliable functionality than some of the add-ons you see on the market for today's flight simulators. There are certainly a few differences and limitations which I've shown in this video, and obviously as a whole Flight Sim 2004 is a very old platform. The flight dynamics and the scenery does not stand up against today's competition. However, if you want high quality flight simulation on a budget, this is absolutely the way to go. Flight Sim 2004 is abandonware and runs just fine on today's PCs with today's peripherals, and being able to fly PMDG for the cost of an airport sandwich is the bargain of the century. Thank you once again for watching, and let me know if you want to see more retro flight sim on the channel. Take care and I'll see you next time.